In this module, we're going to be examining stage 2 of the backward design process. So remember in the last module, we identified our desired results, and then stage 2 is determining acceptable evidence. So we're going to be taking a look at assessments in this module. There are different types of assessment: pre-assessment, formative assessment, and summative assessment. Pre-assessments are usually assessments you do at the beginning of a unit because you want to see what your students know. There are usually no stakes involved, meaning you don't give grades for this assessment. Some different types of pre-assessments could include surveys, inventories, checklists, self-evaluation, and then pre-test. Formative assessments are usually probably the most common type of assessments, ones that you think about when you say that you're going to give an assessment to a student. Those are normally low stakes, meaning you may or may not have a grade for these. These are the most important, in my opinion, in terms of the planning process, because these are determining whether or not your students are learning. These are what can completely pivot you in a different direction. If your teaching isn't working, your formative assessment is going to tell you that. So some examples you can see down here: peer evaluations, quizzes, self-evaluation, concept maps. It could be homework is a great example of formative assessment, group work. Now, summative assessments are the big ones. Those usually take place at the end of the unit. Those are high stakes. This is where students are earning their grades. These could also be, for example, like end of grade testing that are state mandated. This is determining whether or not your students have learned. So some examples there, you could see there: exam, standardized test. It doesn't have to be a test. It could be a project. It could be a presentation. It could be an essay. It could be a portfolio. So those are examples of summative assessments. So I just wanted to give you another visual between formative versus summative, because these are different. So you can see here, formative assessment is monitoring the student's learning, whereas summative assessment is evaluating the student's learning. Formative assessment is more of a process. Summative is a product. Formative takes place during learning. Summative takes place after learning. Formative is used by both students and teachers. Summative is used by teachers. And then, like I said, in terms of grading, formative can be graded like homework, that type of thing, but it's usually a low stake, meaning it's not going to necessarily affect a student that much in terms of their grade at the end of the course, whereas summative assessment is always going to be graded. Formative assessment, like I mentioned, really can pivot you in terms of how you're teaching or what methods you're used for teaching. There have been many times during my career as a teacher where I've given a formative assessment and I've gotten it back and I've thought to myself, oh gosh, either I did something wrong or they're not understanding what I'm trying to say, and maybe that is going to pivot you in a different direction where you have to teach something a different way. So typically what happens with a formative assessment, you administer some type of task, you examine their work. That's going to inform you on whether or not are they getting this, are they not getting this, and that's also going to inform your instruction. Is this something that we need to spend more time on? Or maybe you give a formative assessment and you're like, oh wow, everybody's got it, so we can move on. Like I said, formative assessments really, as a teacher, are most important because that's going to determine how you teach. It's going to completely inform your instruction. You can give a formative assessment and then the next day be like, okay, we're doing something completely different from the way that I thought we were going to do it. In terms of summative assessments, I wanted to give you some more examples over there on the right hand side so you can see kind of the flow chart of how it goes. You do your pre-assessment, you do your formative assessments, and then summative, like I said at the end, that's your big evaluation. That's your project, that's your test, that's your demonstration, that's your portfolio. Your summative assessment and your objectives should be directly aligned. A critical component of giving assessments is you as the teacher giving feedback to your students, especially when it comes to formative assessments. By giving feedback, students know what they are doing right and they know what they're doing wrong. I think we've all been in classes before we received a grade on something and we're over here wondering, well, why did I get points taken off? A framework that I like to use as a teacher is the TAG system. So when you're giving feedback to a student on an assessment, first start by telling something you liked, so something they did well. Be very specific. Don't just say great job. There's some examples, some sentence starter examples over here on the right hand side. So after you tell something you like, ask a question. So why did you do something a specific way, or did you consider doing it this way? And then finally, the last is give us a positive suggestion. So one area for improvement might be blank. One problem that I see with your work might be blank, or next time I strongly suggest that you do whatever the case may be. Especially given those type of positive suggestions during formative assessments is really going to help the student when it comes time for them to do their summative assessment. I would also really encourage you to incorporate rubrics. And I don't care what grade level you teach, rubrics can be used from kindergarten through 12th grade. So a rubric is something that, especially with assessments that are subjective in nature, so if you have a paper, or if you have a portfolio, or if the student is doing like a presentation, there's no right or wrong, there's no checks or X's, and so I would really, really encourage you to develop rubrics, and you can kind of see how rubrics go here. You have the criteria area, you have the observable details, and then you have the level of achievement. It is critical that you give your students the rubric before they do the paper or the presentation or the portfolio, so they can see exactly how they're going to be graded. Now let's take a look at your assignment for this week. So the first thing you're going to have to do is read pages 139 to 167 of your textbook, and that's going to go over a lot of different strategies that you can use for both formative and summative assessments. Also, there's a great section in your text. One that really stood out to me was on page 161. There's a section on making assessment a learning experience. So I think all of us experience some degree of test anxiety, and this certainly goes for our students too. So this comes up with a way, some strategies that you can lessen that anxiety in your students, giving them a second chance. Or like I had a professor one time in college, I love this. His last question on all of his exams were, was there anything that you studied that I did not test you on today? If so, list it here. And it was just a way of proving to that instructor, like, okay, there might have been some questions that I don't remember, but hey, I did study. Here's everything that I learned. Or there's some other strategies here, like giving your students an extra inning. So telling students like, hey, you're going to have 10 minutes tomorrow to go back on this test and fix anything that you missed. So go home tonight and study. So really encourage you to pay attention to that section there. Now, things you're going to submit to me this week: Backward Design Stage 2 worksheet and a note to future self-journal on assessment. So what are some takeaways, maybe some ideas that you gained from your text this week that you could use as a future teacher? I did want to point out that right below this video, there are two different documents that list, you can see the first one lists 60, the second one lists 56. These are just great strategies, great ideas for formative assessments that you could give during the middle of a lesson to give to students just to check their understanding. So I would encourage you to save these documents somewhere to your computer because you're going to want to use them in the future. And then your Stage 2 worksheet, it's a continuation of what we did last week. So I want you to use that same exact standard from last week. And now I want you to come up with your assessment. So there's going to be a chart at the top that you're going to need to fill out, that you're going to list your performance tasks and then other evidence. Essentially, performance tasks is another way of saying your summative assessment. So what's going to be that big assessment? It could be one or two things at the end that you're really evaluating whether or not your students have achieved those learning objectives that you made last week. So I give you an example here. Remember, I did the circles standard as my example. So this would be my performance task. And then your other evidence could be those formative assessments that you're going to use during the middle of the lessons or the unit to just make sure and check your understanding for your students. Feel free for the other evidence to use from your textbook or for some of those PDFs that I posted at the top of the page. So you're going to be completing that worksheet here. There are 5 additional questions that you're going to answer after you fill out the chart, and those are going to be directly related to what you read in your text. So again, make sure that you read your text first before completing this assignment. And then last but not least, again, you're going to do that note to future self journal. Give yourself some ideas that you're going to use in the future in terms of assessment that you're going to want to make sure that you don't forget. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.